Welcome to this summary of Homer's Odyssey, Book 12. This is a summary for people who have never read the text before, aren't familiar with it, especially geared to those students who may be taking the National Mythology exam this coming year. The 2020 bibliography notes that Book 12 of the Odyssey is where the questions will be sourced from. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Odyssey at all, who are completely new to this text, there are 24 books in total, and each book or series of books can be categorized based on the plot, what is happening. The first 4 books are typically called the Telemachy, because like the Odyssey sort of examines the journey of Odysseus, the main character protagonist, in his long homecoming from the Trojan War, his 10-year-long homecoming. In a similar manner, the first 4 books of called the Telemachy typically examine the journey of his son to the other Greek islands to try and find news of his father. So the son is making a smaller scale version of the journey that his father is making, and they're both pursuing, in Greek terms, noble intentions. In books 5 through 12, Odysseus has arrived from Calypso'S island. He had been trapped on Calypso'S island for 7 years, and he is telling his hosts, the Phaeacians, he is telling them about his long travels, his long journeys, and all of the trials and traverses he experienced before arriving at Calypso'S island. Book 12, that we'll specifically be discussing here, examines the final aspects of those trials, especially specific instances that occurred on the sea. This is why Book 12 is sometimes referred to as the sea trials. The original versions of the Odysseys didn't come with section numbers, chapter titles. The chapter titles were added on by later authors and translators. And then books 13 through 22, so after he's finished telling the story, he returns to his homeland of Ithaca and basically ends his 10-year-long journey home. There are books 23 and 24, but they discuss topics a little bit outside of this structure, and we won't really be discussing them any further, so I didn't include them in the slide. At the beginning of Book 12, Odysseus and his crew arrive back at Circe's island. Circe is a goddess, a sorcerer. Odysseus, his crew, and Circe have a pretty long and complicated relationship, but by this point in the narrative, both of them are on very friendly terms. They're very positive. Odysseus and his crew came back to bury Elpenor. Now, Elpenor was a spirit who they had met in an earlier journey to the underworld that happened in earlier books. Odysseus went down to the underworld, saw a lot of dead spirits, and among them was his former crewmate Elpenor, who had told him that he had actually died. No one on Odysseus' crew had noticed that he was dead, but Elpenor said, "I died on Circe's island. Go back and perform the funeral rites for me." Odysseus and his men go back and do as they are asked to do. Circe decides to host them on the island, and since she is a goddess, tries to foretell the future, gives advice to Odysseus as to what he needs to do in order to make it home with all of his men. She warns him about the Sirens, who are going to call out to them from the sea, and lure the crewmen, lure Odysseus towards their rocks, where if they were to go to those rocks, they would then be crushed and they would die. This is the famous scene where Odysseus' crewmen strap him to the mast so that he, even though he can react, verbally to the callings of the sirens, he cannot actually move physically. This strapping to the mast, the whole procedure, the way that his crewmen, put wax into their ears, all of this was recommended to them by Circe. She then notes that there are moving rocks, dashing rocks, that is one particular path that they could take home, but no ship has ever made it past these moving rocks. They've all either been crushed. Well, to clarify, there's been one ship that's made it through, and that's the ship of the Argonauts, because they had the protection of a very, very powerful goddess. But no other ship has made it through these moving rocks, so Circe recommends that they avoid them entirely. Instead, they should try to navigate, essentially thread the needle between this whirlpool called by Charybdis, right here. They should try and thread the needle between this whirlpool and the six-headed monster. Circe ultimately recommends that they stay closer to the six-headed monster, because in that sense they will only lose 6 men, whereas if they get caught up in the whirlpool, they will lose all of their men. And then finally, Circe recommends that they not stop at the island of Helios, that they shouldn't stop there, because if they were to kill, Helios is the sun god, if they were to kill one of the sun god's cattle, the journey home, she predicts, will take much, much longer, and only Odysseus will make it back home. All of his crewmen will essentially be killed if they kill the cattle of the sun god. And with these predictions, her predictions, by the way, in terms of the sun god, have also appeared earlier in the story in the prophecies of other deities and other immortal beings. With those predictions, Odysseus takes his men, leaves Circe's island, and begins the journey. And everything kind of proceeds in the way that Circe has said. They face the trial of the Sirens, apply her procedure, they make it through. 6 men are eaten by the Scylla monster. Yet, once they make it to the island of the sun god Helios, they deviate from Circe's advice. As the protagonist in the story, Eurylochus, who's a member of Odysseus' crew, he was one of the ones who, when Odysseus was trying to break free from the chain to run out to the Sirens, he's one of the ones who stood up and tied him tighter to the mast to make sure that he would stay on the ship. Eurylochus, once they have made it to the island of the sun god, speaks a long narrative and essentially says that not all of the men are like you, Odysseus, and we need a break. We need to stay here. If we keep going, if we're too tired and we encounter some kind of challenge or trouble, then we won't be able to face it. We'll be much more likely to drown because we're so tired. It's a little bit of a fallacy. Yes, the gods have told you there's danger on this island of the sun god if we kill the sun god's cattle. But on the other hand, if we keep going, there's also danger because we'll be too tired to fare the sea in order to go through the sea safely. Now, as you can imagine, everybody else on the crew agrees with Eurylochus, and they stop on the island of the sun god. What happens next is that they essentially get stuck on the island. The winds are blowing in the wrong direction for at least a month, and the men eventually run out of provisions. Therefore, they are eventually forced to kill some of the sun god's cattle so that they do not die of famine. And again, it is this protagonist, Eurylochus, who gave, quote, evil counsel to my comrades from the point of view of Odysseus. Hear my words, comrades, for all your evil plight. All forms of death are hateful to wretched mortals, but to die of hunger and so meet one's doom is the most pitiful. Nay, come, let us drive off the best of the kind of Helios and offer sacrifice to the immortals who hold broad heaven. And so it is his responsibility that the cattle are dead. And as is foreseen, terrible things happen. One of the nymphs who lives on the island and takes care of the cattle for Helios, while he is, of course, driving his sun chariot, she goes and tells Helios about the cattle, and Helios goes and complains directly to Zeus, the king of the gods. Zeus hears his complaints and agrees to deal with the issue. So the winds change finally, and Odysseus and his men get back on the ship. Once they're back on, and they've gotten a little way out to sea, the storms begin to shake and thunder, and Odysseus sends down a large bolt of lightning to destroy the ship. It is at this point that all of the crewmen, the remaining crewmen, are dispatched of, and Odysseus is left floating alone on the mast. Incidentally, he gets floated all the way back to Scylla and Charybdis, back to the six-headed monster, very many-headed monster, and the whirlpool. And he's forced to hold onto a fig tree while the whirlpool has his ship. Eventually, once the whirlpool subsides, the logs come back up to the top, and as he says with the disguise, of course coming from some kind of goddess, he rows out. Odysseus, is able to row himself on these couple of logs out from this dangerous place and makes it to Calypso's island. Now, at that point in the narrative, he wouldn't have known it yet, but Calypso eventually imprisons him on her island. She's another nymph goddess, and keeps him for 7 years. His journey is kind of static for those 7 years, and more bad fate begins to come his way due to his absence from his home island of Ithaca. At this point, Book 12 ends, and Book 13 picks up with Odysseus thanking his hosts, ending his very, very long flashback narrative, and beginning the real journey home to Ithaca, after the period when all the journeys occurred and after his 7 years captivity on Calypso's island. Let's do a little exercise created by the National Mythology Exam test makers. These are 12 quotes from Book 12, and you need to identify which character said which quote. I'll let you take a minute to see if you can do that. Pause the video and move through the examples. I hope you've had some time to give this exercise a try. Here are the answers. So, number 1, I had a forewarning from Tiresias and Circe too. Both told me I must shun the island of the sun, the world's delight. Nothing but fatal trouble shall we find here. Pull away then and put the land astern. So we know that this is somebody who has talked to gods and goddesses, who is talking to Circe. And remember, at the beginning of Book 12, it's Odysseus who is talking to Circe the whole time and learns about all of the different ways to deal with their troubles. So in this case, it must be Odysseus who is relating to his crewmen what Circe told him. Peace, Helios, shine on among the gods, shine over the mortals. Let me drown thy one hot bolt and make splinters of their ship in the wine-dark sea. Now, who would be able to shoot a thunderbolt at a ship and destroy it? Well, that would be Zeus. So this is a promise of Zeus. Old shipmates, our stores are in the ship's hold, food and drink. The cattle here are not for our provision, or we pay dearly for it. This is something that Odysseus comes to again and again. We need to make sure that we don't kill the cattle while we're here. We need to make sure that we don't kill the cattle, because even though he has accepted his men's logic, he is still trying to prevent the wrath of the gods. So this is another quote from Odysseus. Steer wide, keep well to seaward. Plug your oarsman's ear with beeswax netted soft. None of the rest should hear that song. So number 4 is advice to a certain person, none of the rest shall hear that song to a specific person. In this case, we kind of know that it's Odysseus about the Sirens, about one of these troubles. And we know that the person, the goddess giving advice directly to them at the beginning, is Circe. So that's a quote from them. They have killed your kind. Now this was a little bit of a smaller detail, but I remember I mentioned that there was a nymph who told Helios about the killing of the cattle. So in this case, that would be Lampetia. That would be the name of that nymph. 6. And if I shout and beg to be untied, take more turns of the rope to muffle me. So somebody, is giving advice to other people about what to do in this siren situation. Now we know that Circe told Odysseus, but Odysseus is saying that, you see that the person is saying, I need to be tied. Circe isn't going on this journey, so it must be Odysseus relating the procedure, the advice now to his crew members. All deaths are hateful to us mortal wretches, but famine is the most pitiful, the worst end that a man can come to. Now, you may remember this quote from earlier in the presentation, but it is coming from our protagonist. It is this person spinning these other reasons, trying to find up other excuses in order to circumvent, in a sense, the will of the gods. So it's no other than Eurylochus. Sweet coupled airs we sing. No lonely seafarer holds clear of entering our green mirror. Now, I didn't put up the quotes of when the Sirens are singing. There is that song in Book 12. But nobody who listens to us ever escapes us. Well, there's only one challenge here that really fits that description, and that's from the point of the view of the Sirens. So this is what they are saying, their mission, their purpose, what they do. We sing, and nobody escapes us. Restitution or penalty they shall pay, and pay in full. Now at this point, if you just had this, you might think, could be Zeus, because they shall pay this restitution. But then you get the second half. Or I go down forever to light the dead men in the underworld. So who lights men? Well, that would be the sun god Helios. So this quote is a threat to Zeus, saying that I will leave the world in darkness if you do not punish these mortals for killing the cattle. So that's B, Helios. Do you never tire? God, look at you. Iron is what you're made of. Here we all are, half dead with weariness, falling asleep over the oars. Well, this is the same logic from an earlier quote again from that protagonist, Eurylochus, as to why they should ignore the advice of the gods specifically. And many times, his advice, his reasoning, is in fact very convincing. Hearts of oak, did you go down alive into the homes of the dead? So this is right after they've come to the underworld. This is the beginning, after they've come out of the underworld, this is the beginning of Book 12. And we know that at the beginning of Book 12, they arrive on the island of Circe. So it must be Circe who is asking them about their journey to the underworld, because there isn't really any of these other characters present yet. O Father Zeus and gods in bliss forever, you made me sleep away this day of mischief. So it's somebody who is addressing the gods. So that means it's probably not a god, it's probably one of the mortals on the list. You made me sleep away this day of mischief. So what could this day of mischief be? Well, considering how closely linked it is with the gods, may be the day that they have finally ignored the advice of the gods, when they kill the cattle of Helios. That is the first time they have gone against the gods' prophecy. So who would not be involved with the killing of the cattle? Well, that would be Odysseus. And he is essentially saying, why did you make me sleep while they were killing the cattle? Otherwise, I would have done something. So it's a very clever way to try and absolve himself from any responsibility when it comes to the cattle. These 12 quotes in the summary before gives hopefully a baseline understanding of Book 12. I would still always recommend, reading the original text, reading those 20, 30 pages in one of the many translations available. Will have one linked in the description below that is from the Perseus Digital Library, or a version that is in the Perseus Digital Library. Furthermore, I will attach some multiple choice practice for Book 12 for those of you who are taking the National Mythology exam. Thank you for listening. I hope this was instructive.